This is a beginner Flutter tutorial on Riverpod for state management. We're going to connect a new Flutter application to the Ricoh Theta camera using a camera emulator. You don't need the camera for this tutorial. We're going to use a cloud-based API. So this is a HTTP API which is publicly available. You'll be able to complete this tutorial of Riverpod with no additional tools, just using Flutter and your workstation. Let's create a new Flutter project. I'm going to create mine on just the Windows platform because that's what I'm developing on right now. You can specify Android or iOS, and we'll call it Riverpod. So the name of the camera is Theta, and we'll call it tutorial. So we have the new Riverpod tutorial project. I'm going to add Flutter Riverpod. Flutter. And then for the network connection, I'm going to use the HTTP package, Flutter pub add HTTP. I'm using VS Code with the Dart and Flutter extensions. In the lib, we'll go to main.dart. So there's the guts here in the material app. I'm going to delete the contents here. And everything below it, I'm going to delete. Here, I'll put the scaffold in. And the body, we'll just start with a placeholder. So to get rid of the blue, I'll just make it a const. To start using Riverpod, we have to use a provider scope. So I'm going to wrap this with widgets. An auto import of Flutter Riverpod right there. I'm going to replace the stateless widget with a consumer widget. And this build now requires, because it's in a consumer widget, it requires a widget ref, which is from Riverpod. We'll call it ref. So now we have this ref that we can refer to. It's kind of like the context. Okay, so this is from Riverpod, Flutter Riverpod. And this widget ref is also from Flutter Riverpod, right? So provider scope is new, consumer widget, and widget ref. All right, so we should probably put the providers in a separate class, but we can start it off here. We'll return a string. To access the data that the provider provides, we're going to use the reference with the keyword watch. In the parentheses of watch, we're going to place the name of the provider, which is response provider in our example. The provider provides a string. We're going to assign it to a variable for the response. text here. And then we're going to display the text within the body of the scaffold. We'll use a Flutter text widget, and we'll just see if we can get anything to appear. So we'll put the response text there, remove the const from the material app, and boom, we're starting to use the Riverpod state management. We're now ready to watch for changes to the state, although the state is not changing. We can now also use Riverpod to change the state. So we're going to assign the state a new value. To do this, we'll create a GUI with some buttons on the top. So we'll make a column, and we'll have a set of buttons on the top that will change the state. So we'll grab the information of the camera. You don't need the camera for this tutorial. And then on the bottom, we'll have the response. So it's kind of a simple app, but we do need the interaction to really start to understand how to change the state of the application with Riverpod. I'm going to divide the column with the expanded widgets so we can control the spacing. We want the top part to be bigger, which will be the GUI buttons, and the bottom part will be the response that we're getting from the API server. It will be a cloud-based API server. So we'll start off with our first button here, text button, and we'll use this button to change the state of the application, which will be reflected in the response window. We're going to use a API command for the camera called info that will get the information from the camera. Camera is simulated. You don't need the camera. So we've previously used ref.watch. Watch is a keyword from Riverpod. We're next going to use ref.read. The difference is .read, it just reads it one time, where watch will constantly look for changes to it. And inside the button, where we're going to pull the state of the provider, we don't want it to be constantly watching. So make sure that in the onPressed callback here, you're only using ref.read, and it's the name of the provider, which we call response provider. .notifier is a keyword, and now we can pull the state from the provider and assign it to a new value. It's a nice little workflow with Riverpod where you don't have to create your own setters to set the state of the provider. Let's give it a shot. Boom. You can now change the state of your application, and these buttons can be anywhere on your application or any screen. To use the cloud-based API for the camera simulator from the Rico Theta, we're going to use this server called fake-theta. Theta is the name of the camera. And we're going to look at the API. If you could also use something like JSON placeholder. It's basically functioning the same thing, right? We just want to get some data back from the cloud. And the fake theta will work. You could use any API server. Here's the endpoint here, fake-theta.versal.app. So they've got it running on the Versal hosting system. And the one we're going to use is info. So we'll just use a get. Very simple, no payload. We'll just use HTTP package. To make the cloud-based call, I'm going to use the HTTP package. So package, let's import it. HTTP, http.dart as HTTP. And this as HTTP is by convention. It makes it a bit easier to refer to the different protocols like GET. So we'll set up the response. This should be async, so I'll have to add that in later. It has to be async await. And we'll do the GET to the endpoint, and we'll add the path. So from the API documentation, we know that the path is OSC/info. The GET requires a URI, not a string, so we'll use URI.parse to convert the string into the URI format which the HTTP package requires. We're getting a response data type or object from the HTTP GET. So to access the body of the response, we have to use .body, and it's not working because it knows that I need to put async here and wait. So we have to wait for the response to come back from the network. And just to be safe, I'll put a toString here, and I'll go. You'll see it. Boom. Okay, it's going out to the internet. It's talking to the camera simulator, and it's getting the response from the camera. So all these good things are the serial number, the firmware version of the camera, lots of good information. So from the simulator and from some other API endpoints, the JSON is not printed as formatted text. So I will use the Dart convert to kind of pretty print format this. This might not be the case with some API endpoints, but from the physical device camera, as well as the cloud-based camera simulator, there's no formatting in it for JSON. So I'm first going to convert the string into a Dart map using JSON decode. And the reason for this is that although we're getting this string there's no formatting in it. And I did an auto import of the Dart convert. Now with my Dart map, I'm going to set up an encoder with 2 spaces as the split for it. So we're going to encode the map into a string with spaces in it. So for this, I'll use JSON encoder. So with indent, and we'll just put 2 spaces between the single quotes. Now with the encoder set up, I can take my Dart map and make a formatted response. So I'll use the encoder.convert, and it's already set up for the indent. So then we put the map in there, which is the response map right here. So now we can go back to the state in ref.read. Then you have our name of the provider, .state, and we can just assign it to the formatted response. So we run our application, hit info, and the response from the API server is now nicely formatted. We can't scroll it because it's just a text widget here. If we wrap it within a single child scroll view, we'll at least be able to scroll through our response. So even though this is a bare bones app here just for the demonstration of Riverpod, let's wrap it within the single child scroll view just to make sure that the responses that you're getting from your API server is a full response and that everything's working smoothly with Riverpod. I'm going to move the button into a separate folder called View. This is just to illustrate that it's pretty easy to organize your GUI if you're using a state management system like Riverpod. So we'll first extract the widget from the info button here, and we'll have to convert it also into a consumer widget because it's actually getting the ref as well, but this is an easy process. So the reason that ref is red on line 50 is that we're using a stateless widget. When we extracted it, we can just simply convert it to a consumer widget, which is from Riverpod. And then once it's a consumer widget, we just go to the build and we add the widget ref for the reference for the build. And with that, we can then read the contents of the provider with the ref.read over line 48 now. Okay. We just get rid of some of the blue lines from the linting rules. Then we'll copy or cut out the contents of the new info button widget, and we'll create a new file called info-button.dart under the view folder, and we'll drop it in. There's a lot of red because we still need to import the material widget system as well as the Flutter Riverpod classes. We also don't have the HTTP package for the network call, so we need to import that in. And actually, as you remember, we called it, when we imported it, we called it as HTTP. So we'll have to do that manually. We can import right now we have the providers in main. We'll move it out later. Just to give our app a little bit closer to what you would actually do with Riverpod. So we'll import the package for HTTP as HTTP. So now back in the main.dart file, the info button is red because we need to import that new file with the class that we just put in, and then there's a bunch of imports here that we can delete because we don't need it since we moved the button out. So we're still using the main.dart file for the main GUI as well as the provider. And the info button still works, even though it's nicely organized into a separate folder here at least. Let's move the single provider out into a new file, which I'll call camera providers, and call it Dart. So we'll just cut out our single provider so that it's slightly easier to find, and we'll move it into this new folder for our providers. We'll import Riverpod into this new file of camera providers, and back in main.dart is watching the provider but doesn't know where it is, so we have to import the file where the provider now resides. So back in the info button can't find the response provider, so we just import the file with the class in it and test to make sure it still works. Everything is working great. So we'll now create a second button, state button, and it'll pull a different API from the camera, the simulated camera. And for this demonstration, we'll just copy the entire contents, and we don't have a separate class to use as a template for all the buttons. So we'll just change it quickly for this tutorial. So we'll just change the name to state button, and the name of the constructor, also state button. The text of the button that appears as the label will now be state. And we'll have to change the API endpoint. We'll leave it the same for now, and we'll look at the API documentation to understand how to set the API endpoint. But let's add the button into that column in main.dart so we can get the GUI working and test it out. The GUI is working. Info and state are pointing to the same API endpoint right now. So even if we press it, everything looks exactly the same because it's the same endpoint. But let's change it right now. All right, since most API documentation is the same, we'll start off with the example here for the Rico Theta API documentation. And we're going to access OSC/state here and get all this great information about the state of the camera. So it's basically whether the battery is charged in the camera, if the camera is taking a picture at that current time. So we don't need a lot of this information. The documentation does specify that it's a post command and not a get, although this post has no body. And the path is OSC/state right there. And it's getting the state of it. Great. Batteries inserted. Batteries at about 1/3. It's batteries. It's not plugged in to be charged. There's a lot of great information here about the camera. The latest file URI does not work right now. Since it's a camera simulator, we can cover that in the future of how to get it working on a fake storage simulator. But let's just focus on the API commands right now. So in addition to simple things like a string or integer or Boolean variable, the state provider, and there's many of these providers, we're just using the simplest, one of the simplest ones, can also pass a widget. So for this example, we will use it to pass a widget just for the, can quickly get more practice with this one provider type, which is the state provider. And we'll use it to pass around a Flutter widget. And the reason for that is eventually we want to pass around an image, image.network, to pull some type of camera image or a picture over from the network. But we'll first just convert that text response here to a response widget. When you display the output, instead of just using text and then the string, we will actually just put the response widget variable there. And then in the buttons, we will have it, when you press the button and you get the response, it will be the response widget, which will just have text for now. And then in the next button, a text widget, and the next button will have an image widget. Okay, should work the same. Yeah, it's looking good. So we're going to create another button called image button, and this is kind of simulating the act of taking a picture, but we're not using the exact same API call right now. Just to keep the tutorial shorter, this part is just to illustrate that you can use the Riverpod state management system to move around an image widget. So I think actually I'll just copy the info button instead of creating a new button from scratch, and then I'll delete most of the guts of the info button and put a image.network widget in there. So let's first paste it in. And we don't need, since we're not dealing with the text of the response, and then we'll put this to be a image button, a name that we created. Maybe I should have called it something else because it kind of sounds like it's a icon button or something, but we just created this name image button. And we use image.network. And I'll pass it a known URL for an image from the camera. It's actually the thumbnail image of the camera. The camera image is actually pretty large, so we're just going to use a thumbnail, which is much smaller, easy to pass through the network. So it could be any type of, just any image URL here, something that you get from Imager or any place actually. Any type of website. I'm just using this one from the camera. You could use the same one too. It's a small thumbnail, equal rectangular format. Once we got it in there, we'll delete the unused import statements. Add the image button to the list of buttons in the row on the top half of the screen. And then we have our image button here. We click it and boom, the image is pulled over the network and you can see it. So this is a small equirectangular view, which is a 2:1 aspect ratio from the camera. The actual image is about 11K resolution, so it's pretty high resolution. And in the next video, we'll show you how to put this into the mobile app so you can get this very high resolution image that you can zoom in and see the details of a room for things like maybe building inspection or real estate sales. It could be construction sites, these type of things. And it's kind of fun to work with the 360 images because it really helps you to get a feel for a scene. And we'll be supplying some of these sample images in the next video, so you don't need the camera. And have a great day. Join us at community.theta360.guide, and I'll post a link to the code for this tutorial, as well as the links to the API information. Have a great day and have a lot of fun.